وعليكم.
Alaikum Nur, walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be unto God, the Lord of the world. Here we are in our
It's
first.
good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you live finally.
I know it's been, well, I don't think we've ever actually videoed live.
No, we haven't. We haven't. Well, welcome everybody to this, our first session of reading Mulla Sadra's Wisdom of the Throne. I'm pretty psyched. This is going to be a interesting course. One thing I should mention here is that for those of you who followed the Fusus course, in a sense, in a kind of a inferential sense, I take this particular book as being a sort of roundabout commentary on Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, such that where there are a lot of opacities in the text of the Fusus al-Hikam, in a more logical and kind of systematic way, Mulla Sadra appears to shed some light on the meanings of some of these. For example, the question of being itself, or what Izutsu terms with the Latin term actus essendi, the act of being. These are very, very important concepts to get one's head around. Otherwise, even Arabi comes across as completely nuts. You read something from him in one page, and then he says something completely different, contradicting himself on the next page, which is a patented style of writing of Ibn Arabi's, and it's been source of endless complaints. But so this is, let me just say what my approach to Mulla Sadra overall really is. I like Mulla Sadra a lot. I consider him probably the greatest philosopher, or the greatest synthetic philosopher that the Islamic civilization produced. However, the way that I approach Mulla Sadra is more as a commentator on number one, the Avicennan tradition, then as a commentator of Sohrawardi, and also, most importantly of all, a commentator on Ibn Arabi, although while he copiously cites him all the time and talks about, and cites things, he very rarely cites Muhyiddin ibn Arabi by name, and that's probably because of the times he was living in, etc. So this is how I approach Mulla Sadra, and this is particularly the reasons why I chose this text above any other text to continue our course, is because this will kind of get us a little bit deeper into getting our heads around into what Ibn Arabi was talking about in this Fusus al-Hikam that otherwise drives a lot of other people batty in trying to get their heads around these very, non-linear kind of concepts. But Mulla Sadra, someone put it to me this way, Ibn Arabi takes you by the heart, but Mulla Sadra takes you by the mind and leads you to the same place, in a very didactic kind of way. So throughout this course, we will try, or I will strive to refer back to some of these concepts that we were talking about in the Fusus al-Hikam course. Sometimes they're inferentially stated, other times they're not. And in many ways, Mulla Sadra sort of goes beyond Ibn Arabi in terms of like really delineating the nitty gritty, the building blocks of this kind of thinking that Ibn Arabi, kind of revolutionized in Islamic thought and Islamic philosophy and theosophy, generally speaking. So for this first session, rather than me reading from the text, I summarized some of the elements of the two introductions that we're going to be talking about. These summaries are going to crop up throughout the text. Hossein mentioned in the Telegram group that we can take this introduction and take it for multiple sessions and talk about every element of it. The good news is that that's exactly what we're going to do, because what Morris does in this introduction is to beautifully summarize all the key issues that this text is going to be covering throughout the next, I think probably about 36 sessions we'll have, maybe less, of covering this. I want to go slowly. So whereas with Ibn Arabi, we did either a complete chapter or half a chapter for every session, what I will do with this particular course is we will go through two of the sections, or two of the ishraqs, as The original text has it per session, and with the Sabzavari text kind of in the background, because I think this Shahr Manzume, or this particular penultimate section of the Quran al-Fara'id of Sabzavari, beautifully complements the wisdom of the throne. So, for example, just that, like Mulla Sadra begins his discussion with, defining his terms, so doing the standard Aristotelian thing, giving us the had and hudud, the definitions of things. Sabzavari does that absolutely spectacularly, but obviously in a highly scholastic kind of way. What Izutsu did in his introduction, in those first 10 pages anyway, before the biographies, is that he really tells us how to read Sabzavari. And so my thinking was that if we read these two texts together, where one is complementing the other, we will start to get our heads around these ideas, like, for example, being, or actus ascending, the act of being, quiddity, what is it, how do we differentiate between being in its undefinable term versus being or mojud, that which is being, and what is the corollaries between the concept of mojud, the existent, and the quiddity, or the mahia, or ain, as some other philosophers put it. So we will look through all of these very carefully and at our own pace. I don't want to overwhelm anybody. I think it is more important to get to understand these ideas rather than to rush through the text. So even though this is probably, the Wisdom of the Throne is probably one of Mulla Sadra's shorter texts. The shorter than this would be his, I think it's his Kashf Asrar Jahiliya, the breaking of the idols of ignorance, is probably one of his shorter texts. But as a philosophical primer, this is, number one, a more accessible text than his Kitab al-Mashair, the book of the metaphysical prehensions. And also it covers, unlike the Mashair, it covers the entire panoply of Mulla Sadra's thinking. So in a sense, the Wisdom of the Throne is a sort of a summary and synopsis of his massive four journeys of the soul, the Asfar Arba. For us, the good thing is that what Morris does is that he went through pretty much the entire corpus of Mulla Sadra that was available to him back in the 70s and early 80s. Morris was a student of Henry Corbin's. He studied with him both in the Institute of Imperial Institute of Philosophy in Iran back in the 1970s. So he was amongst those European and American students that went to Iran and studied under State Jose Nas, Henry Corbin. Toshihiko Izutsu himself was there for half a year. Dariush Shayegan, all of these great names that people who are interested in Islamic philosophy. My old friend, the late Peter Lambert Wilson, was there. He was acting as a secretary to Nas and also acting as an editor-in-chief for the Sophia Perennis magazine that they put out back in there. So it was a great time. This was the Iran under the last decade of the Shah, but you have some very interesting philosophical activity, and these folks would interact quite regularly with the Hosa, the seminary, especially the branch of it that was specializing in Islamic philosophy. So you have people like Tabatabai and Corbin having these very interesting interactions, which was later compiled, by the way, into a whole volume, the conversations between Henry Corbin and Tabatabai. So this was just such a great time, and Morris was there, and he was studying under all of these guys, primarily with Corbin and to some extent with Nas. Back then, we didn't have all the great critical editions of many of these texts that we have now, but yet they were still available. And for a advanced student of Islamic philosophy like James Winston Morris, he could either access these texts in Tehran itself or go to Qom. I met Morris twice and picked his brain a little bit about his experiences there, and he says it was like being in another world, literally. So this was the product of his studies in Iran. In Princeton, they let him do this as his dissertation, which was very rare in America, because in the American system of university, they don't like you producing texts as your doctoral dissertation. They'd like you to do analytical studies, but Morris got away with doing this at Princeton. And he produced a magisterial piece of work, in my opinion, amongst the English language studies of Mulla Sadra. I consider this second to none. My friend Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmed and I have a difference of opinion. He seems to think that Fazlur Rahman's book, The Philosophy of Mulla Sadra, is the best or summum bonum of English or European language studies of Mulla Sadra. I completely disagree. James Winston Morris also offers an oblique criticism of that particular book, which I very much agree with, and that is that Fazlur Rahman had this very Aristotelian penchant, on an extreme level. So the Mulla Sadra that we see in that book of his is more an Avicennan Mulla Sadra, where, as with this particular book, we get to see Mulla Sadra the Akbarian, Mulla Sadra the Illuminationist, as well as Mulla Sadra the Avicennan, all at the same time. And these are important elements of Mulla Sadra because he was all three of them at the same time. And he synthesized all three of these tendencies into a single philosophical edifice. And in this particular book, its logic of transcendence and what the meaning of the wisdom of the throne itself is, and the kind of fluidity of this meaning within this text, we're going to explore and talk about. And I think we will benefit from this. And those of you who are in the Ibn Arabi class, you could then start to refer to these ideas that we were looking at in the Fusus. And if I start another Ibn Arabi class, if you're here and you want to do another reading of the Fusus, then you can take this with you into that, so that then you have a much better kind of gauge to approach Ibn Arabi. And if I do the Ibn Arabi course again, this time what I'm going to do, instead of jumping straight into the text, I'm going to start with looking at the 12 propositions of Dawood Qaisari in his commentary on the Fusus Alaykum, which Mukhtar Ali translated as his dissertation as The Horizons of Being, which is a very good text. He gives us both a critical edition of the Arabic of the 12 proposition and an English translation that is annotated. So I would probably, this time around, I would start with that, and then we would go into the Fusus itself. I have that, Nate. If you look in the file section of the Telegram group, you'll find that text in there, so you can download it for yourself.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So this is my approach to this. A book that, if you haven't seen, I haven't seen a PDF of it online, but I think people should look at if they want to go further in their Mulla Sadra readings, is this book by Christian Jambet. I think it is a very good book, The Act of Being. It came out back in the zeros. It was published originally in French, I think in around 2000, and then it came out in its English translation by Zone Books in 2006. And it covers a lot of interesting ground. Part one, the metaphysical revolution, then part two, the existential revolution, part three, salvation. And this is like almost a 500-page book. And he translates massive chunks out of all of the works of Mulla Sadra, and particularly the Asfar, the four journeys. And that is a pretty good book to read. And if you have Arabic, I have 2-3 different editions of the Asfar. If you want to look at that, I can upload that to the Telegram group, and you can, go for it yourself. Hassan, when I uploaded all those texts, I also uploaded Khajavi's edition and translation of the present text that we're going to be looking at, the Hikmat al-Arshia. So you can follow along in the Arabic of Khajavi's edition together with the English that we'll be looking at, if that's easier for you. So this is basically the agenda. Rather than me summarizing the introduction of Morris, since we're going to be looking at this throughout the next couple of weeks, I thought I would just basically open the floor, and we would have as lengthy or as deep or as sidetracking a discussion as we can for this first session. And then in the next session, we'll start with, first, we will start with the exordium to the wisdom of the throne, and then we will also read the concluding testament. So we will start at the beginning and the end in the next session. So we will read those two sections. And then the following week, we will start with the first two propositions or the first two ishraqs, together with the first two in Sabzavari's Metaphysics of Sabzavari. So we're going slowly, orienting ourselves from each week, deeper and deeper, rather than just rushing into the text, because I want people to get their heads around these so that we're exploring these concepts beyond even the commentary canon of these ideas. Although I think this commentary tradition is great, there's some great stuff in there. More often than not, even if you are trained in this particular kind of scholastic philosophy, it can be extremely misleading, because even though Mulla Sadra is writing a theoretical text more than anything else, the assumption of this in this particular theoretical text is an experiential one. So rather than talking about experience, he is laying out the theory of how to get to that experience within this book of the Wisdom of the Throne. So we want to kind of very slowly and gently come to that, and then really delve into these ideas, because I think these particular ideas, when one engages with them on a personal level, give a much better context and approach to dealing with issues of psychology, on very basic, our being, more than, say, for example, the conventional psychological arsenal of Western psychology that we have. And I think even more than the Western existentialism of people like Heidegger or Camus or Sartre and especially for people who have a spiritual proclivity or have some kind of an association with the Islamic trajectory of that. I think a book like this, or even the Fusus al-Hikam, provide a much stronger and much more powerful context to approach the world with, and the self and the world with, than anything out there. So I'll open the floor. Whoever wants to go first, you have the floor. Go for it. Anybody?
Salam Sheikh, good to see you again this year.
See you. Hope you're well.
Thank you. I'm doing okay. So I guess my question is because I read the introduction, and there's a lot going on in the introduction.
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that Mulla Sadra's approach is broadly syncretist? I mean, I know it's not accurate to say that, but what are the ways in which it is accurate? What are the ways in which it is not?
He is syncretist in the sense that he is bringing three primary trends of Islamic philosophy or Islamic high intellectual thinking together. Number one, Avicenna, right? The Aristotelian Neoplatonism of Avicenna, which is not strictly out Aristotelian, because you got to remember, with Avicenna and even his predecessors like Al-Farabi and Al-Kindi, etc., even his successors all the way to Tusi, Islamic Aristotelianism is a Neoplatonic Aristotelianism, right? So they even considered in the Islamic world elements of Plotinus that were translated into Arabic as the theology about Aristotle, even though it was Plotinus. Then you have the Illuminationism or the Ishraqi philosophy of Shahabuddin Yahya Sohrawardi, which is very dear to me, which is a kind of a Neoplatonized, Neo-Zoroastrian, Neo-Hermeticism. Okay, a very interesting and unique philosophy that created a lot of controversy immediately in his own time, but wasn't fully appreciated for another probably 80, 60, 70, 80 years, until he was rediscovered by Ibn Kamuna, a Jewish convert to Islam, who retrieved the works and literally the legacy of Sohrawardi and brought it back to life. And then obviously the great Andalusian Dr. Maximus Ibn Arabi himself. So these are the three primary thinking in Mulla Sadra that are brought together. And to some extent, one can make the argument that Mulla Sadra also incorporates certain Ismaili elements. It's a big debate, and it's usually dismissed by the more Hozavi lovers of Mulla Sadra. But if one reads, for example, some of his some of the texts, like like the one I just mentioned before, the Kasa Asnam Jahiliyyah, the breaking of the idols of ignorance, and even elements of the Asfar. There are certain crypto-Ismaili stuff that crop up in Mulla Sadra. So it appears that he may have had access to even botany texts. And one reason for that is that, as Morris kind of puts his finger on in the intro, Mulla Sadra had a real concern to resolve certain divisions that he had seen in the greater Ummah. He was very weary of the kind of sectarianism that the Safavid state had created, even though it had brought Shiism and made it the state religion. Yet the way that the Safavid state articulated that was extremely sectarian. They, persecuted most of the Sufi orders out of Iran. Nimatullah, for example, was exiled to northern India for almost 200 years. And some of the other groups and whatnot. And this, even though Mulla Sadra gets sometimes very critical of organized Sufism, he nevertheless, he had a concern about the kind of sectarian milieu that the Safavid state had created in Iran at this time. Because Iran, prior to the Safavid dynasty, and even probably in the first 1 or 2 decades of it, was an extremely interesting Islamic melting pot. But once the Safavid state established itself and chose this ideology as a state ideology, it just got really narrow-minded, and as it increasingly empowered the Shiite clergy, many of which it had to import from Lebanon and Iraq, it got more and more sectarian. This bothered Mulla Sadra. So in his greater metaphysics, he wanted to resolve a lot of these kinds of issues on the philosophical level. So it is possible that he, in his readings, he went as deep as he could have in the history of Islamic thought, and that also included looking at the Ismailis and the botany legacy in general, whatever was left of it at his time, texts and whatnot that he could get his hands on. But during this era, we find very interesting developments beyond Mulla Sadra and the school of Isfahan occurring. For example, one of Mulla Sadra's teachers is this great polymath that my old sheikh was kind of a descendant of, and this was Sheikh Bahauddin al-Mali. And al-Mali was a philosopher and a theologian, an occultist, a traditionist, a Quran commentator, a scientist, architect, all of these things at the same time. But simultaneously, so far as we know, and this comes from a statement by Imre Kurban, is that he was also associated with a quite interesting Zoroastrian high priest near Shiraz by the name of Azad Kevan. And Azad Kevan was run out of Iran and into northern India, and found himself in the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, and founded a sort of a Zoroastrian Sufi order, the Sepasiyan. This guy has fascinated me for years as well. Recently, there was a really interesting monograph about him that that was published in Iran that I only found out about a few months after it came out. So this is the milieu that we're talking about. So although the state is becoming more and more ideological and sectarian and whatnot, you're also having these very interesting developments happening, whether on the side of Mulla Sadra himself or close associates and circles that are closely connected to Mulla Sadra. So this was an extremely interesting time. Mulla Sadra's own teacher in philosophy, Mir Damad, is a fascinating character in his own right. He is probably the most opaque and impenetrable of scholastic philosophers in any language. I intellectually traumatized myself about a decade and a half ago when I decided to take a retreat and take his Qabasat, his book of the burning embers, and read through it to try to understand what he's talking about in a khalwa. And it just hurt my head at the end of that experience. So I was going over passages 10, 20, 30 times, try to get my head around this guy. And he was doing this deliberately, his teacher, Mir Damad. He was deliberately writing in a very dense kind of way, lest he be accused of any kind of heresy by his colleagues. But Mulla Sadra didn't do that. Mulla Sadra, even though his own style of writing is not easy, but nevertheless, he simplified this kind of language and was more open about the ideas that he was talking about. There's a joke about this, that when Mir Damad dies and the two angels come, Munkar and Nakir come to his grave to question him, that he gives them an answer that these angels can't even understand, so they have to go back to God to try to make sense of the answer that Mir Damad gave him. And even God won't be able to, doesn't understand what Mir Damad says. And God says, well, he was a good man, so let him in. So they let him in. This is the joke about Mulla Sadra's teacher. This is how impenetrable he was in his language. But like I said, Mulla Sadra is more open, more ready to talk about his ideas and the implications of his ideas than his teacher was. But Mir Damad it was a mystic in his own right, and very deeply indebted to Sohrawardi, even though he was writing more as an Avicennan, but he was fundamentally as illuminationist, and his Takhallus, his nom de plume, was in fact Ishraq, illumination. So he, Mulla Sadra imbibed from a teacher like that. And also another teacher, like I mentioned, Sheikh Bahauddin Amali, who was then hanging out with the Zoroastrians in Iran. So this was a great time to be alive, but also a great time to really look at the greater implications of existence from a syncretic point of view. So with what happens with Mulla Sadra is that then this syncretism is actually a method more than anything else. And this is something that usually people who have read as much Mulla Sadra as they could come to, is that Mulla Sadra is not a follower. Mulla Sadra may be very much indebted to his predecessor, but he always also seems to take his own position on a lot of these things. Because one of his concerns throughout his philosophy, and you see this very clearly in his Asfar, is the position of the individual in relation to the collective, whether the collective of existence, the mahiyat of wujud as a whole, or the individual vis-a-vis the society that he's living in. And this is why certain, contemporary modernist thinkers in Iran have taken his, for example, his notion of transubstantial motion, the Haraka Johariya, as kind of an earlier iteration of, either evolution or as, progress, the endless progress of the world, etc. The movement in substance, that this is something that happens at the level of substance. So, but we will also find out that this idea has kind of multiple ramifications, that it doesn't just mean that, it means a few other things as well. That on the primary meaning of what Haraka Johariya or the transubstantial motion is basically what Ibn Arabi was talking about as creation in each moment. So if you bracket that idea that we read in Ibn Arabi, and then as we get deeper into this text, these two ideas, the idea starts to make a little bit more sense. But with Mulla Sadra, this Haraka Johariya has multiple implications also on a social and even political level to some extent. So I hope that answers your question about his syncretism.
Yes, thank you. And a number of other questions, which I may have asked if you could give me another 45 minutes. Thank you.
You can ask them if you, this is why we're here.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. Thank you.
Shane, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering about the different stages of Suhrawardi and Ibn Arabi regarding quiddity, that it was some type of essence, but still a differentiated one, and not the kind of godhead of undifferentiated experience. So I was wondering where Mulla Sadra, where he picked off after the philosophers that came before him regarding this.
We're going to look into that actually as of the third session as deeply as we can in our reading, but briefly I will put it to this. The question of existence and quiddity, even in Sohrawardi, is not as straightforward as a lot of people make it out to be. And I would say even Izutsu, when you read his Hikmat al-Ishraq, the way that let me put it this way, what Suhrawardi is objecting to, right, in his discussions with the Avicennians, is that the Avicennians say, for example, that existence is primary, but it's still an accident. And this kind of creates a bit of a contradiction because Suhrawardi is looking for a primacy, right? Something out of which everything, all substance of the universe can be related to. And since the basic Avicennian concept kind of exists in this no man's land, this philosophical no man's land, where Avicenna holds existence to be primary, but still an accident, right? So it has this kind of a very weird relationship with necessary being, with the wajib al-wujud. With Suhrawardi basically saying this is nonsense, there has to be a primacy, and primacy does not admit of accidents. So he took the quiddity, but with Suhrawardi, the quiddity of quiddities is light, right? Where, and this is where this conversation gets extremely interesting, because it seems that what Suhrawardi is defining as quiddity is more akin to how people like Mulla Sadra or even Ibn Arabi, etc., would define as being, as the act of being, the actus essendi, or the ester, the be itself. So we're going to explore a lot of that. There was a lot of discussion from Avicenna to probably Nasruddin Tusi about all of these questions, and each of these guys has their own kind of take on the question of quiddity and essence and existence, and some of these don't make any sense. Sometimes they also make a distinction between a mahia or a quiddity and a mojud, which then confuses the issue even more without clarifying why that is. Whereas with Mulla Sadra and his school and Sabzavari, these are all defined. Okay, the quiddity is the essence, and then the mojud is, or the existent, is what emerges from that essence, etc. They get very clear in clarifying all of these definitions about what we're talking about and what then being is. Being is, we cannot really define being. Everything that we define as being is actually an existent, something that is being, rather than being as the act itself, as the totality, as the universal. So all of these are explored, beginning as of the first couple of propositions of both the Wisdom of the Throne, then also Sabzavari's Sharh Manzumeh, the commentary on the philosophical poem. So we will get into all of this. We'll discuss all of this. There are a couple of PDFs around, of Walbridge's translation of Suhrawardi's Hikmat al-Ishraq. I don't like his translation, to be honest. I think it's a very obtuse translation, but I think during the Fusus class, I uploaded a copy of that. If not, I can do it again. I can put another copy of that up there so that people can access that and we can talk about it.
That's great. I mean, would you say that there's a difference between acts and identity?
Yes and no. This is a very, very thorny question in Mulla Sadra. It's never adequately answered in any of the predecessors before that. What Mulla Sadra would seem to suggest is that the act is what produces the essence, right? So the act of being, which is the universal, which is basically the absolute being, which is God, right, produces its articulations as acts of being. So that then we have an infinity of acts throughout all of existence that are just merely articulations of the one single unifying absolute being itself.
Great. Thank you.
Sure thing.
I suppose that I was struck, in addition to the many things that were in this introduction, the historical context was very interesting to me too, because the Safavids were such a eclectic bunch, getting started as a militant Sufi order, and then doing this about face, and then bringing in the ulama to standardize Twelver Shi'ism. And on top of that, it sounds like Mulla Sadra didn't have a very high opinion of the Usuli Fuqaha. and their very legalistic and literalistic understandings of
Not at
things.
all. Neither did his teacher, but his teacher, both of his teachers, Sheikh Ba'i as well as Mir Dama, they didn't have a high opinion. Because just remember, the people that were being elevated, people like the Majlisis, the two Majlisi brothers, they were, I mean, when you read their own writings beyond the Bihar al-Anwar, they were extremely bigoted. The older Majlisi was actually termed Sufi Kush, the Sufi killer. So the bigotry, the kind of sectarian bigotry that these people had, uncompromising, and always very suspicious of the more speculative irfan of the time and anything that remotely reeked of Ibn Arabi to these people. So that is the reason why the opinion of Mulla Sadra was so negative of these people, and also to some extent his own teacher. But Mir Dalman had protection; he had, direct royal patronage, as did Sheikh Ba'i. So they could get away with a lot of stuff that someone like Mulla Sadra couldn't. And this is one of the reasons why they ran him out of Isfahan, because he was openly talking about some of these ideas, and they couldn't have that, so they ran him out. And he went to Kahak near Qom and just retreated for about 10 years.
Yeah, that was very, very interesting to me to see how Mulla Sadra was really swimming against the currents. I also thought it was interesting later in the introduction when Morris mentioned that Sheikh Ahmed al-Ahsai was very critical of Mulla Sadra, but at the same time, and then he brings up your area of expertise, the Babis sort of reconciled the two in their own way.
Yes.
Now, I don't know too much about that, but it was very fascinating to me to read that.
Yeah, this is the case. I was going to include my notes of my reading of the 3 volumes of Ahsai's Sharh Arshia. The notes are just a complete mess. It'll take me probably half a year just to put them together properly. But yes, the long and short of it, here, let me break it down this way. Ahsai had a love-hate relationship with Mulla Sadra, right? And he looks at Ibn Arabi through the lens of Mulla Sadra. And what becomes very weird is that especially in his commentary on the Arshia, he has this just like unbelievably acerbic response to Mulla Sadra. But what is really weird is that he criticizes Mulla Sadra and Mulla Sadra's language in each of these various propositions, and then argues his way, through it, then, cites various hadith and Quranic verses, and then ends up at the same place and claims that his position is the correct one. And he does this repeatedly throughout this commentary. It is embarrassing, so which kind of makes you wonder, well, why are you criticizing, Mulla Sadra? And the long and short of it is, number one, his reliance on Ibn Arabi. But that in itself is a very weird thing, because for all the criticisms that Ahsai makes of Mulla Sadra, the way that he articulates the issues is kind of like as a Shiite Ibn Arabi. So it's he may have a problem with the wording of the concept of Wahdat al-Wujud, which Ibn Arabi never actually used. But he ends up in so many different significant instances at the same place that Ibn Arabi is talking about, but with one exception, and the exception is the universalism. On the level of soteriology, Ahsai cannot accept this idea that everything is saved and the breath of the merciful is permeating all of existence. So Morris is correct in saying that Ahsai had a penchant for being a Gnostic sectarian. But interestingly enough, this doesn't kind of rub off on his successors, who kind of into distance himself and back away from Ahsai's reactions to Mulla Sadra and Ibn Arabi. Sajjad Rezvi, about 10 years ago, I think, nailed it when he said that, all of these are evidence of kind of the anxiety of influence, because we got to remember that Ahsai himself, in a sense, comes out of that Akbarian Shiite milieu. So his immediate predecessors in Bahrain, where he came from, was a great Shiite Akbarian by the name of Ibn Abi Jumhur al-Ahsai. And this was, Ibn Abi Jumhur has been called a crypto-Ismaili, but primarily, Ibn Abi Jumhur was an Akbarian Shiite. So apparently, before going to the Atabat, before going to Iraq to study with Bahr al-Ulum and all that lot, Asai had inherited Ibn Abi Jumhur's personal library, which would have included Ibn Abi Jumhur's own books and possibly his collection of the writings of Ibn Arabi, etc. So he comes out of that milieu, and above all, one of the greatest of the Shiite Akbarians is Hafiz Rajab Bursi, the author of the Masharaq al-Anwar, which is a very interesting Akbarian treatment of some of the more theopathic hadith attributed to the Imams. Al-Ahsa'i himself, in a sense, is an Akbarian, but a kind of a uber Shiified, capital G Gnostic Akbarian at the same time. So what's going on is a very, very complex thing.
No, that's fascinating, Wahid. I get the sense that, not that I'm an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I get the sense that he's trying to reverse engineer Akbarianism.
Yes, but he doesn't succeed because what ends up happening, whether with Sayyid Kazim al-Rashidi but especially the Babis and the Bab, is that you find a kind of a very interesting eruption into a kind of at least with the Babis, a kind of a post-Islamic Akbarianism. I mean, the presence of Ibn Arabi, as I've argued in the last couple of years, the presence of Ibn Arabi in the writings of the Bab is all pervasive. And I'm not saying that the Bab had sat down and read Ibn Arabi, but whatever he had read and filtered through Sheikh Ahmed Asai came out as the other end, as a kind of as a universalized Shia Ibn Arabi at the tail end of that process. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Anybody else? Hussein?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Yeah. I mean, there's just, this was so long and sprawling. I mean, Morris's style is just like this. Every time I read anything by him, it's just like endless, like sprawling, so much information. But there's like one kind of overall like history of philosophy thing that I'm chewing on, that I've been kind of thinking about for a while, that I don't completely understand. So Mulla Sadra is, when it comes to the peripatetics, so Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi and I guess Al-Tusi and
Tusi, yeah.
but they're also neo, like you mentioned, they're Neoplatonizing peripatetics. The sense that Morris gives is that for Mulla Sadra, he wants to keep their forms of demonstration, and he wants to stick to that. He wants that included, but that he wants to go beyond them.
Yeah.
And that's the part where I tend to get tripped up, because when I really look down at like the brass tacks, I'm not sure exactly in what sense he's going beyond, especially because this whole concept of transcendence is described as a noetic realization. It's the noetic tahqiq.
Yeah.
So you have the word nous there, and you have the idea of theoria, of theoretical contemplation. But then the way Morris puts it, that transcendence, that realization, is actually going beyond what the peripatetics would think of as being theoretical contemplation. Like those are different. So I just get tripped up on the epistemology.
Remember the beginning of the Hikmat al-Ishraq, right? Where Suhrawardi talks about the type of thinkers or travelers on the path. He says that the true philosopher is the one that has harmonized both the rational and the mystical perfectly and balanced them out, and then criticizes the one without the philosophical training and then criticizes the philosopher without any kind of a mystical penchant. So what Mulla Sadra is attempting to do, without directly quoting Sohrawardi, is this. He's trying to establish that. Now, where this significant divergence primarily occurs is over the question of wujud itself. Like I mentioned, the Avicennians have this very schizophrenic relationship with the definition of wujud, and it's infuriating. It's extremely infuriating. They just don't take that leap. And this is why Sohrawardi just basically said phooey to all of that. And throughout, many of the categories of definition and whatnot in Aristotle, because he was trying to get to a question, to an issue, to peg an axiom of primacy, which the Avicennians up to that point had just miserably failed, because their reasoning of it is just very illogical in certain places. But with Mulla Sadra, over the question of wujud itself, and how he places it as a logical category in a primate state, and then says that this cannot be the act of being, or the esto, the be itself is indefinable. The being is, so we cannot define whatever we say about it is not a definition of it, because it defines everything while itself is undefinable, is putting into creating a logical category of mystical intuition that the Avicennians themselves wouldn't accept previously, other than Sohrawardi, but in his own kind of reformulation of the Aristotelian canon. So that this is where, and it's a revolution. If you know the history of the Mashah, and especially over this question of ontology, what Mulla Sadra basically was, it was already latent with Sohrawardi and obviously Ibn Arabi, but what Mulla Sadra did was just basically kicked all the hudud out and said, this is where we're going to start. This is how we're going to discuss these issues. And so this was a very, very important thing that Mulla Sadra did. Now, arguably, and I agree with a few of the people out there who pointed this out before, it was actually the students, it was Sadruddin Qunawi and his students all the way to Qaysari who really began this revolution. So, for example, like I mentioned, the 12 propositions of Qaysari's commentary on the Fusus, all of these 12 propositions, right, are latent within the wisdom and from the entire philosophy of Mulla Sadra. But the way that, for example, Qaysari articulates it, it doesn't articulate from the point of view of the Aristotelian canon, even though he's using Aristotelian language to articulate that. What Mulla Sadra is doing is placing this question fairly and right at the center of the Aristotelian organon itself, without falling into these equivocations about accidents and whatnot, something being primary but being an accident. What does that even mean? That these peripatetics held about wujud, so he doesn't prevaricate on that question. He's very decisive that this is how we're going to talk about this. And so once you do that, the implication is then it is that much more obvious that then the question of tahqiq starts to take center stage. And so psychology and eschatology and all of these things start to become very important. Whereas with the peripatetics, they either rationalize these things away in their typical kind of way, or don't want to even talk about it because this is theology, this is kalam. We don't want to deal with this.
Okay, so I'm trying to get an idea of like exactly where that difference lies, because you mentioned the question of wujud, and I think you're saying that there's a different kind of mystical intuition that comes with affirming the primacy of wujud. So it's the very nature of the noesis is different. Like there's a different dimension of noesis that Mulla Sadra is opening up that isn't available to, because the peripatetics do talk about noesis. Like even Aristotle has this idea of direct intuition of intellects and the prime mover. And
that's what his concept theory is, essentially. That the way that he explains that. But what beginning with Sohrawardi, what these guys are trying to say is that kashf without kashf and tahqiq have two dimensions. There is the zogi, there's the tasting element of it, and then there's the rational demonstration of it, and that you cannot separate one without the other. And so with Mulla Sadra, for example, when he's criticizing, occasionally when he's criticizing what he calls the mutasawwif, the Sufis, what he has in mind is the more kalandari, kind of Sufis who make ecstatic locutions without the ability to prove what they're saying, to a philosopher like him. And he thinks that the implications of these sorts of things are deleterious to a given society, because this is also one of his concerns, the implications of these ideas, whether in a Gnostic sectarian or a Gnostically monist kind of trajectory of things. He believes that these things have negative consequences, so we have to be careful in how we navigate this terrain in either one side or the other. And so he's reformulating the terms of the Aristotelian canon of his time with certain proposition in the way that he demonstrates being the primacy of being, that is very different from his predecessors, which we're going to kind of look at a lot more deeply in the next coming weeks through both this book and Sapsavari. But the premise of the method itself, comes from the Hikmat al-Ishraq, that very introductory part of it. Anyone else? Hassan?
Sidi, I will ask a more general question, again, more historical. For example, authors like Suhrawardi, Mulla Sadra, and other Islamic philosophers, they have quotes from Plato. My question is, how Islamic tradition access Plato, given the fact that the only which they have were just parts of Plotinus and his Annals translated in some Aristotelian works, and that's all. So, how we access the Plato narrative and integrate it to our thought?
Well, there's a really interesting history to this. During the early part of the Abbasid Caliphate, the Abbasids started employing Syriac monks, Christian Syriac monks, who were versatile in Arabic, Syriac, as well as Greek, to start translating these fragments, or whatever corpus of the Platonic and Aristotelian writings existed, into Arabic. When they got to Plotinus, Peter Adams has written a whole book and dissertation about this. When they got to Plotinus, for some reason, rather than correctly identifying him as someone other than Aristotle, these, I think it's Enneads 5 and 3 or 4 that were translated as the theology of Aristotle, were attributed to Aristotle rather than as being the Enneads of Plotinus. But we had, for example, much of the Republic that was translated. Many of Plato's letters were translated. I think the Meno and the Theaetetus, or parts of the Theaetetus, were translated. And there seems to be some evidence that parts of the Symposium were also translated. So there was a substantial amount of stuff from the Platonic dialogue that were translated. And then for Aristotle, most of it was translated. To the point that there's a story about Avicenna that he had, for years and years, for about a decade, he had just been continually reading the entire Aristotelian corpus available to him again and again, not understanding anything, until he went to a bookseller who had a very rare copy of Al-Farabi's commentary on Aristotle, and took it home and read it with him. All of a sudden, the entire Aristotelian corpus suddenly started making sense to him, and that's when he began to write himself. So there was a substantial translation project that began under the Abbasids. It had slowly been starting even before that under probably the late Umayyads, but by the time we get into the early Abbasid period, with the emergence of figures like Al-Kindi, these translations were really going apace, and a lot of good stuff was being translated, sometimes not very accurately. Another text that is wrongly attributed to Aristotle is parts of the Liber de Causis of Proclus that is attributed to Aristotle as well. So together with Proclus, or the pseudo-Proclus, and pseudo-Aristotle, we add two very central elements of at least the Neoplatonic corpus. And these were the elements that then, the two elements that really then Neoplatonified Aristotle for a lot of these Islamic philosophers, beginning with Al-Kindi and then ultimately, with the Ikhwan al-Saqqa, the Brethren of Purity of Basra, who really took this stuff on and incorporated it into their own thinking and whatnot. And the influence of this Greco-Hellenistic stuff on especially the Ismailis is very deep, and it began from a very early period. So besides the secular philosophers of the court like Al-Kindi and then later Al-Farabi, etc., already with a lot of the sectarian groups, the Shiites, Ismailis and etc., these ideas were also being received very well. And so they were incorporating it into their own arsenal of discourse and whatnot. But as Europe, and especially as Europe enters the Middle Ages and starts to reject the Greco-Hellenistic legacy because of its own reasons, the Arabs and Muslims, beginning from the late, Umayyad period, and then really flowering into the Abbasid period, took all this stuff on and just translate. These, these Syriac monks became extremely important to this project, and they were, very actively sought after by patrons, usually royal patrons. So yeah, a lot of stuff was translated. Because one of the things that the Muslims realized as they became the inheritors of this massive geographic territory of empire is that you have all these people, right, who have very sophisticated approaches to their own religion, and we don't. So, we need to start then incorporating a lot of their own, a lot of these sorts of intellectual subtext and context and language and whatnot in order to understand and even dialogue with these people, even go beyond these people, to preach and proselytize. So this was the main concern, but all of this took on a life of its own. And as you see, for example, with the emergence of the Mu'tazila, and then their detractors, and then later the Ash'arites and their detractors, and then how all of this kind of then synthesizes in various periods. We saw this in Ibn Arabi, where you have the Ash'ari and the Mu'tazilite positions happening with each other simultaneously. You also find this in Mulla Sadra, where he's also bringing a lot of these debates amongst the Kalam theologians, and basically dealing with all of these various questions as well. The occasionalism of the Ash'arites, and the occasional atomism of the Ash'arites, and the kind of uber rationalism of the Mu'tazilites that lends itself to more of the apophatic way of taking the question of the relation of God to the world, etc. All of these are present in Mulla Sadra, as they were with Ibn Arabi and his own students. And with the Muslims, all the way, I would say, until very recently, you had a extremely precocious and curious cosmopolitan mind. They wanted to know as much as possible. And because you had that very famous hadith, seek knowledge, even if it be on China, during at least the first 1,000 years, this was taken very seriously, by especially certain cadres of Muslim intellectuals. Marshall Hodgson talks a lot about this in his 3 volumes of The Adventure of Islam, which is a phenomenal study of Islamic history. So this is how it happened. This is how all of these texts entered into the Islamic world, and pretty early on in the first 100 years. Yeah.
Just one more. Do you think that we can extend the Platonic let's say, uh, interaction with the Muslim tradition directly, not just to the first 1 or 2 centuries of Islamic history, but directly to the prophetic time. For example, some authors make analogy between the metaphor of the cave of the Republic of Plato and the beginning ayats of Surah Yasin, when there is talking about the people who their heads are locked, there is a stone behind them and before them, and or it is speculation.
Look, one thing that is, I think, is obvious that, at least the fundamentalists, whether in the past or the present, don't like to acknowledge is that the Quran echoes a lot of the ideas that were present at this time, whether from the various religious groups or the philosophical tendencies. All of these in various ways are echoed within the text of the Quran. I mean, I mentioned this in the last course that there is a lot of the Avesta within the Quran. And you see this, in this whole, the light and darkness, binary that, reoccurs throughout the Quran, the believers and unbelievers, although it exists in the Old Testament and the Torah as well, but in the way that it is articulated is very Avestic. But these various elements of Greco-Hellenistic thought are also present and crop up from time to time within the text of the Quran. I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, the prophet is basically articulating the zeitgeist of his time. Why should that somehow disparage the Quran? I fail to see that argument, whether from the side of the detractors or whether from the side of the exponents. I think it's great that's fine. That's what a messenger or Rasulullah of his time is supposed to do. Is he's supposed to even address the zeitgeist around him, which includes all of these various ideas.
So I have another question. So Morris talks about this socio-political almost goal of Mulla Sadra, where he wanted to influence people and he wanted to lead to a sort of like renaissance of thought. And by doing that, he focused on like three dominant spheres of knowledge. Do you think that that sort of intellectual exercise is something that we should engage in now? Is it something that every generation should engage in?
100%. We absolutely should do that. We should be producing, a variety of Mulla Sadras of our own time all the time. I think that's very important because if you look at the Islamic world today, and especially for the last 100 years, and many sectors of it, it is ossified. And even in the Shia world, in Iran, that has happened. So, Mulla Sadra was a real radical for his time because some of the ideas that he's positing, on the one hand, he's sort of very surreptitiously criticizing the reality of the Safavid, milieu of his period, but he's also looking ahead, about, an unfolding world. And he himself, I think, would be the last person to think very highly of the way that, for example, the Hausa in Iran has ossified his thinking and appropriated him and only teaching within a certain context. Because when we're going to read this concluding testament for next week, he's extremely critical of that institution. Extremely. He calls them devils. You'll read it. So, yeah, I think that Mulla Sadra was very serious about looking forward. And some of the ideas that he's talking about are not incompatible with at least the basic concept of democracy. I mean, this is something that I have argued many times, that a wahdati wujudi kind of perspective on the world lends itself more easier to basic notions of democracy. We're not talking obviously about liberal democracy, but democracy, rule of the people, because the ultimate authority here is, God or the Imam, capital M, who is everywhere and nowhere and all that. So this is my thinking about this. This is why it just defies logic how someone who spent their entire career in the halls of teaching Mulla Sadra, like Khomeini did, could end up at this concept of the rule of the guardianship, where the Vilayat al-Faqih, and this whole, very totalitarian Islamic state that the mullahs in Iran created after 1979. It just defies imagination because Mulla Sadra's thinking is extremely open, is extremely democratic in the basic sense. It's not trying to concentrate power, in a cadre, especially of Fuqaha, which he was so critical of, and who persecuted him and drove him out of Isfahan.
May I
Sure,
add something?
go for it.
Well, I suppose Mulla Sadra and various thinkers and leaders of those previous times were operating on just such small scales of population. And I think I've brought this up before, that it's a question of how do you, once the population exceeds a certain size, how do you have these more flexible, democratic sorts of societies? Like, do you think it's possible to enact on a big population those same principles, or does it by its very nature require a smaller population?
Well, if we were to answer that question, let's say from the point of view of Mulla Sadra, if we would say, let's say that if Mulla Sadra was to be presented as a social engineer, right? What would he posit as the method of social engineering? Well, one thing he would say that, we need to have a culture that instills in the population both the intuitive approach to the greater question as well as a rational approach. So, obviously this uber materialism that we have experienced in the West for the last 200, 300 years would be completely thrown out. He wouldn't necessarily shun science, technology, or any of that stuff, as his predecessors and even successors didn't. But he would insist, for example, on how the issue of instrumentality is to be approached, how the techne, in the way that Aristotle defines that, is to be approached. These are questions that the West doesn't want to even talk about, because scientific positivism itself is a sort of an ideology that is totalitarian in the way that it's wants to, if it's not real, if we can't make it, if it's not progress in the way that we define what progress is, then it has no reality, and this is all BS, blah blah blah. And then then you look at the implications of that kind of thinking. It's the complete ecological devastation of the planet. So Mulla Sadra as a social engineer would be more attuned to the necessity of balance between that intuitive approach, for example, on the issue of ecological sustainability. He would be more sensitive to the questions of proper pedagogy and how we have to get it right to educate these children, so that they have both that intuitive and the rationalist side at the same time. So they're not just being schooled in either rote methods that he was familiar with, or the kind of methods right now that we have in most of the Western schooling system that also don't seem to work very well for a lot of these kids. So that is where Mulla Sadra would probably come from if he were to become a social engineer.
Thank you.
Sure. Hey.
Actually, there's a question I want to ask, but it might be putting the cart before the horse, and it may not be as simple as it sounds in my head. But can you speak maybe in a introductory kind of way about Mulla Sadra's thoughts on Ta'wil, since Ta'wil was mentioned multiple times in the introduction?
Mulla Sadra, unlike the Akbarians have from Ibn Arabi to Baysari, have a very weird relationship with the word Ta'wil. And that probably comes from their Sunni pedigree. Mulla Sadra has no problem in using that word and that concept. And in his, for example, in his commentary on the first book of Khomeini, what he's doing, he's giving philosophical ta'wil on these hadith. But what Ibn Arabi shunned that word, and he claimed that his commentaries were not ta'wil, although that was what he was essentially doing, ta'wil. because for Ibn Arabi, the literal sense of the Quran is true, but there are also further implications in the meaning of these ayat, of these verses of the Quran. But we're not going to talk about Ta'wil, because in the way that it was socially implemented in the time of Ibn Arabi, it reeked of the Batanis, the Ismailis and whatnot. And even though Ibn Arabi has a very pronounced crypto-Shia element to him, where, I counted hundreds of hadith from the Shiite corpus that he doesn't even cite in his work threads, Fuduat al-Makkiyah. Yet when it came to that word, he had a very negative reaction. He said, that's not what I'm doing. I'm doing straight-laced tafsir, and my tafsir just has many different layers and depths to it. But with Mulla Sadra, he doesn't pretend that as all. He says that what I'm doing is ta'wil, and this is the method of the hermeneutics. That our hermeneutics is the method of mystical or philosophical exegesis. So Mulla Sadra had no problem with that concept at all. And in some places, and especially when you get into his Sharh Usul al-Kafi, his commentaries on these hadiths sound awfully Ismaili and Batini in so many elements of them.
Thank you.
Welcome. Jeff, Kareem, Stephen, anybody else want to say something?
I'm sorry, but I actually don't have any questions or comments right now.
Okay.
Still reading the introductions and still trying to wrap my head, since none of this is my my language. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all the terms and the differences between, like you were just talking about. I have to look them up every time, Ta'wil and tafsir, and just to try to keep straight the basic terms that you're using. So that's what I'm occupied with right now, and I don't really have any comment. So
if anything is opaque or you don't understand anything while you're reading this, to just throw it. And if you don't find it on the internet, I can find it for you. It's not a problem.
I appreciate that. I'm doing pretty good keeping up, but I'm necessarily going to be a few steps behind you guys due to the language barrier and my lack of experience with these types of texts in these languages. So yeah, I'm sorry I don't have anything insightful to say. I'm just kind of listening and watching and taking it all in.
No worries.
So he has a pretty good view, high regard for Plato and Aristotle. And I'm wondering how honest Plato would be viewed on the concept of sort of a noble lie. Because when I look at Plato, particularly like Laws and the Republic, I see a lot of Plato's willing to, you look at his actions in Syracuse. He's willing to justify taking of power and using myth to recreate society.
Yeah.
He's for an active use of things. And I think that includes at least some subterfuge and political deception when we look at his life, but I don't know how that would have been viewed at the time.
A whole tradition emerges, especially with the Neoplatonists, beginning actually with the Neoplatonists, where Plato's Republic is not interpreted as a political text and not as a text of political theory, but more as of a program for the creation of the inner man, or the insan kamil, the complete human being, as the Sufis would understand it. So Mulla Sadra's understanding of Plato is not that kind of controversial Plato that like people like Karl Popper had a real problem with, but more the Neoplatonic Plato, or how Plato is filtered through these Neoplatonists. So the noble lie for Mulla Sadra would be analogous to the concept of taqiyya, of the dissimulation, or the way that Korban puts it, the exercising the discipline of the arcane. That is how Mulla Sadra will take this idea. And most Shiite Platonists basically had no problem with that notion, because it's basically the same thing that they're doing. That in the face of danger, that you are allowed, to dissimulate your real beliefs.
Understood.
This is a very interesting question, because, I've thought about this myself. If you read the dialogues, and especially if you read the Republic on its own, without any commentary, unless you are so versatile in Greek that you pick out these nuances that of language that Plato is throwing. If you read Plato as it is, the Republic comes off as an extremely disturbing political text, right? But, thank God for the Neoplatonists that they kind of moved everybody, at least, Platonists away from that, that this is not how you're supposed to read this text. That in itself is a subterfuge. This is what Plato's really talking.
So more in that later reformed context.
Yeah.
So, because I wonder with Plato, with the way he talks with the myth of the metals and some other stuff, if people would be taking a more metaphorical view to both biblical and Quranic history, or if they're more taking it as a more literal, almost Quranic view of what Plato said. But I guess I've already...
Not literal, or not even metaphor. There's a difference between metaphor and allegory, right? So the way that Mulla Sadra would approach this would be more from an allegorical perspective, and he would use metaphor only in certain cases where a given symbol is not open to being interpreted in any other way, and the literal interpretation just doesn't make any sense. That's the way Mulla Sadra would approach it. With even Arabi, he would just accept it as it is. He would say that if we don't understand a particular symbol, it's because God has not disclosed its true meaning to it. So until God self-discloses the true meaning of that symbol, we take it as it is, right? So even Arabi has that kind of more literist kind of penchant at times, whereas with Mulla Sadra, everything is up to being either allegorically and then metaphorically interpreted. The allegory would correspond to the mystical element, and the metaphorical to the rationalist and the philosophical element.
Thank you.
So on that note, what does he have to say about those surahs of the Quran that start with like letters like Yasin, Alif Lam Mim? What does he have to say about those?
He has a lot of different things to say, but a lot of people have had a lot of different things to say about the disconnect of the huruf al-muqatta'at. Yeah. Avicenna actually gave a commentary on some of these muqatta'at. At least it's accepted that it was penned by Avicenna himself, and so he kind of associates, let's say, the Alif Lam Mim to like the kind of the hypostasis, of the one, with the Aleph representing Ahad, Lam, the Nous, and the Mim in the world of the Mulk, etc. That's what Avicenna's basic interpretation of the three opening letters of this Surah Al-Baqarah. But there has been infinite interpretations of that. Occasionally, Mulla Sadra will throw things in his Quran commentary. He kind of says a few things about these muqatta'at. It's sort of in the same vein of Avicenna, but with kind of an Akbarian spin to these letters. Yeah.
What is Akbarian?
The school of Ibn Arabi.
Oh.
Yeah, because
of course, right.
Yeah, because he was a Sheikh Al-Akbar, the great Sheikh. So the school is known as Akbarian school. Although a lot of contemporary scholars are beginning to kind of dislike that term, Akbarian.
Why?
I don't know. It's just Academics don't like things.
They have to reinvent their careers.
Yeah. Yeah. Anywho, we've gone for about an hour and 20 minutes, unless somebody has another question.
I just wanted to ask real quickly, are allegory and metaphor technical terms that Mulla Sadra uses?
He used San and Tamsil, right? And Majaz quite consistently between the two of them, explaining, yes, there are differences between Majaz and Tamsil. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Siri, I here will follow up on Hussein. Uh, about the MTHAL, also don't know what would be the most correct term in English, but the problem of symbols and the different approaches to it. Correct me if my impression is wrong, but with the philosophers, for example, like Ibn Sina, it seems to me that their approach to this MTHAL is that is some kind of cipher. When once deciphered, we know its meaning. So when we go to what it symbolizes, we decipher it once and for all. But with for example, mystics like Sheikh Muhyiddin, or also with the Ismailis, that the symbol or the mythil, it is have many layers of meaning, and it doesn't matter how deep you to how deep level you go to its meaning. There is always a deeper meaning which remains hidden for you.
Absolutely. Avicenna gets it partially right, in his basic definition of what a mythil is. Where he gets it wrong and then falls into defining a metaphor, a majazi thing, right, is the following. A majaz, a metaphorical thing, is something that can be explained in different ways. So let's say an apple, right, as a metaphor would stand for like a person, right? Whereas an apple as a symbol can symbolize itself and then an infinite trajectory of other meanings associated with that apple, right? So Ibn Arabi is correct. This and also the entire esoteric tradition, when they make that distinction between a tamsil, a symbol, and a metaphorical thing, they're right. Whereas the with Avicenna, he says, oh, once you get it, you get it. It can't be anything other than that. He is, he's kind of working on that basis of the had, of trying, of defining things in the Aristotelian way, where once you define something, that's the essence of it, and we don't have, there's nothing else to it. We go on to the next thing. That's not what a symbol is. So you're right. The symbol has infinite other meanings beyond itself. It is both itself and also many other things that are associated with it. Whereas a metaphor is just a symbol that stands for something else. Yeah. Okie dokie. For next week, we're going to cover the exordium and then the concluding testament. And then the following week after that, we'll start to dig into these really high ideas of being and quiddity and slowly work ourselves through these two texts. So everybody be well, everybody have a good time until the same time next week. Yallah.